Welcome to part 2 of our podcast on Chapter 16, the other descriptive research methods. If you are listening to this part before you've listened to part 1, you should go ahead and stop this recording and go ahead and listen to part 1 first. Go ahead and download that and listen to part 1 of this podcast. As a reminder, our objectives for this lesson are to describe and define descriptive research methods, to discuss the steps in conducting descriptive research methods, to identify strengths and weaknesses of descriptive research methods. In part 1, we had talked about developmental research methods and case studies. In this part, we will discuss the job analysis research methods, observational research methods, unobtrusive research methods, and correlational research methods. A job analysis. What is a job analysis? It's like a case study. Well, it is a case study where a researcher examines particular aspects about a job. Can include professional preparation, can include any kind of training, can include development of products, marketing plans, etc. So it's just to figure out what's going on at the job. Again, it's a type of a case study. And our typical methods with a job analysis is we do surveys, interviews, or we can shadow somebody while they're going through their job and try to determine what they're doing to make decisions on the job itself. And I'll give you an example of a job analysis. Currently, I know somebody who is doing a job analysis at their work where they are involved in developing literature. Their job is to help those who are designing the literature to create good literature. This is at a hospital. You know, when you go to a hospital and you get sick, or maybe your children get sick, and they give you literature about follow-up care or about the illness or the disease. And you get something to read, to take home and read and learn about that. Well, this person is responsible for helping nurses or other medical staff to write that material. Well, they're having some issues with that, and so what this person is doing is developing a survey to understand the thought process of those who develop the literature for the patients. She's going on the back end to figure out why the people develop their materials the way they do, because the issues that she is having is that they write it at a level that's too high for the people who are reading it. It's not in a language, it's in language that it's, for doctors or nurses to understand, and needs to be written at a lower level that people who have no medical background, even to a level of kids, where they can understand it. So that's a job analysis, trying to understand what's going on at that workplace, at the hospital, so they can make changes in the way things are done at that place of work. Some of the weaknesses of this type of research method is that it's really based on self-perception, self-repeated nature of the data. The people can report negative or positive responses based on how they're feeling that day. If they're having a bad day, they may just blow up on you and may not give you real good information. So, again, that's job analysis is trying to figure out what's going on at the workplace and trying to make changes at the workplace. That's really small within that organization. Our next type of research methods that we're going to talk about is called observational research. This is also known as systematic observation. And I had the fine pleasure of spending a whole 10-week summer class in a class where we spent the majority of the time talking about systematic observation. This can be used quite a bit in our area. One of the tools that's used in a lot of in our areas, it's talked about in the book, is called academic learning time, physical education. And so, just so you know, I do not suggest this method and trying to complete this graduate program. I think it's a little bit too involved. It's too time consuming. For this lecture, I have placed an article that shows systematic observation or observational research in course documents. It's an interesting article about Jerry Tarkanian. So if you might want to pause this recording, go and print that article out. It's in course documents under the assigned reading file in a descriptive research file. So we'll use that. I'll refer to that to help us understand that. Okay, so the purpose of observational research is actually like it sounds. It's just to observe. A researcher observes or watches the subject or subjects or subject, it can be one or many, behaviors or action over a period of time. Then at the end they describe what they found. They draw conclusions on what they found. Observations can be done via questionnaires, surveys, or they can actually watch, collect data, and analyze the data. Now, when you're doing an observational research, we need to answer these questions that I have here. What behaviors to observe, who to observe, where to observe, how many observations, when to observe. On the next slide is how to score their observations. So I'm going to go through each one of these questions and give you more information. I'll try to relate this back to the study that I have placed on Blackboard. I believe it's by Bloom, Crumpton, and Anderson, and this was done over at Fresno State, and I know three of those researchers. And the article title is A Systematic Observation Study of Teaching Behaviors of an Expert Basketball Coach. Okay, so what behaviors to observe? The researcher who's going to do this type of study must clearly define the exact behavior they want to observe and look at and study. For an example is what is an effective teaching? What the heck that means? This is a very ambiguous term. You have to be more specific on what is effective teaching. You have to clearly define the different things, categories within that would make somebody an effective teacher. Now in the study, they observed and recorded the teaching behaviors and the verbal cues of Jerry Tarkanian. These teaching behaviors and verbal cues were clearly defined. If you see on page 162 of the article, they clearly defined 12 categories of teaching behaviors. 10 of them were common coaching categories. One was related to humor, and one was for uncodable behaviors. So we got like technical instruction, tactical instruction, and they clearly define what each one of those behaviors mean. And so those are the behaviors that they were observing for. So those are you have to have clear definitions for the behaviors you want to observe. The next question is who to observe. Who are your subjects? It can be a subject or it can be multiple subjects. It can be a classroom. If you got a class of 30, it'd be kind of hard to observe. Is it the teacher? Is it their behavior they're trying to observe? In our study, they studied Jerry Tarkanian. He was, in an article said, he was unaware of the behaviors he was being observed for. And so he would just act as natural as possible in this setting. Okay, so who do you want to observe? Who's your subjects? Where will you observe the subjects? So, where the book talks about two different settings: the natural setting, which would be in a classroom or a gym, or the unnatural setting, which would be like a lab. Obviously, the natural setting would be more like the real world, the actual place, and unnatural would be unlike the real world, but it gives you control of particular things within the study. And so you can control different variables. Just depends on your research question and depends on what you're trying to do in your study. Now, in the Bloom, Crumpton, and Anderson study, they observed Tarkanian at all practice sessions during the entire season. So they are in a gym. They're in a natural setting for this particular study. So for our study, what behaviors to observe? They observed Tarkanian's coaching behaviors. Our subject was Jerry Tarkanian, and where they observed him was in the gymnasium during practices over an entire season. Now, the next question is, how many observations should you make? And this is really dependent on a few things. Number one of them is time. How much time do you want to observe somebody, your subject? How much time do you have? The researcher, what is a session? Is it a class session? Is it the whole, let's say every single class, so it really depends on how many observations you want to make and how much time do you have. The number of observations to be made and the number of subjects and observers do you have. You have 50 different subjects you got to look at, but it's only one person. Well, that's really not going to actually work. So that's just another variable that's part of how many observations you're going to make. Another thing that makes the determination on how many observations you make is the type of behaviors you're going to observe. And also the other factor is the activity duration. Does the activity last a certain amount of time? So that's going to make the determination on what you're going to do. For the Bloom, Crumpton, and Anderson study, they used the revised coaching behavior recording form, which had the 12 categories, and they made the observations over typically a 2-hour practice period, and they chose to do it for the entire season, as I said. So how many observations were they looking for? They were looking at 12 different categories over a 2-hour or 2-hour plus period over the entire practice season. When to observe it, again, there's a lot of crossover between each one of these questions in these areas. When will the observations be made? Again, depending on the research purpose and question. Our study that we're using, every practice during the season, and 2 researchers made their observations. So we had 2 people over the entire season. Now, a little bit longer question here is how to score the observations. There are 4 different methods to collect data. This is what we're talking about. How do we actually collect data? And the first one we're going to talk about is called a narrative or continual recording. And this is a difficult one, I think, as the observer records a series of sentences of the occurrences that they observe. So they're just sitting there listening, and they hear something and they write it down. This is hard, and you can see the problem with that, just trying to record everything. Obviously, the easiest way to do this one is videotape or audio record, and that way you have time to write down the highlights that you're looking for. Again, you still have to have clearly defined things that you're looking for here. This is a really difficult method of doing observations, but this is just one way of doing observations and one method of calculating the data as narrative, just writing down the high points that you're looking for. The next way to calculate, or score your observation is called tallying, getting tallies, or frequency counting. And just like it sounds like, you record each occurrence or frequency of a defined behavior each time it happens for a specific period. So each time it happens, you score. Each time you see it, you say you're going to do this for an hour-long session. Each time you see a particular behavior, you just score it and give it a tally for that particular behavior. The interval method is like the frequency method, except this one the researcher wants to know whether certain behaviors happen in a certain interval of time. So what the observer does is, like, they make a decision that they're going to observe, let's say, a teacher teaching for a half-an-hour period, and every 10 seconds they look up and see what behavior that teacher is doing at that period in time every 10 seconds, and they record that. And they have a score sheet that's for every 10 seconds they code what behavior. They may have 10 different behaviors they're looking for, and every 10 seconds they code the behavior that the teacher is making during that every 10-second interval over the 30 minutes. This is how academic learning time in physical education is used. It's an interval scoring sheet, so every 10 or 15 seconds you score whatever behavior the teacher is doing at that period of time. The last method is a duration method. Similar to the other ones, the observer measures the length of time a subject displays a particular behavior. So if we're looking for sarcasm, when a teacher is being sarcastic, the observer records how long the teacher is being sarcastic. And so they're looking for particular behaviors, and they just record. They have a stopwatch and record how long the particular subject has that behavior. So in our study, the one we're using, the Bloom, Crumpton, and Anderson study, again they use the method, the revised coaching behavior recording form. This is a frequency method. Each time a behavior was displayed, it was tallied. You can find that on page 163. And so that's what they used for their study. The other thing there is using videotape or audio tape. Again, you have to get permission of everybody who's involved there to videotape. Then you can go back and go through it on your own. So it's a good tool to use. You just have to get permission for using videotape. Let's talk about evaluation real quick. When you evaluate the data after you use one of these methods, the data is evaluated through descriptive statistics, means, frequencies, and percentiles. As you can see in the study about Tarkanian, as it would be expected, Tarkanian used tactile instructions the most during practice, 29% of the time. That was the type of verbal displays he used, his coaching behaviors during practice. And so that's kind of how we had analyzed the data for observational research, is through means, standard deviations, percentages, and those type of things. Now, what are the weaknesses of observational research? Some weaknesses here are that definitions may not be accurate. and not really describe the behavior correctly, and then the data and the conclusions are wrong or erroneous. So that's a big weakness, is if you don't clearly define the behaviors. Another weakness of this type of study is that observers must be trained and know what to observe for. It's really limits the number of behaviors that you can observe, because you can't observe everything. Even if you have 2 people or 3 people, you still are limited because of that. Another weakness is that some behaviors cannot be observed. You can't define it, and you really can't observe for it. The other thing that is a weakness is that the observer may change the behavior of the observed. For example, just having people there observing you may change the way you actually act over time. And that's one of the reasons why typically with these observational type studies, it's a longitudinal study. It's over time, so people get used to having other people around. And this is especially true if you use videotape. You may actually have people act differently because they're on TV. They know they're being recorded. Other thing is, it's time consuming. It'd be wise if you have more than one observer. They have to be trained. If you read the article about from Bloom, Crumpton, and Anderson, you'll notice that they did what's called inter-rater reliability testing to make sure that 2 people who are observing had similar numbers. They saw similar things, and so there was consistency. You're not just relying on one individual. But if you have more than one, if you have 2 or 3 people observing, you got to make sure they're observing the same thing. And another problem with observational research is that the observer can become tired and change their rating over time, and those type of things. And to me, the biggest weakness of this study, this type of method, is just time. It just takes a lot of time to do it. It takes a lot of upfront work too, with making sure your definitions are correct. So again, the study is a really good example of an observational research method. It's kind of interesting too. At least it's local for us Fresno people. Okay, we're going to move on from observational research, and we're going to talk about unobtrusive. Did I spell that wrong? Okay, unobtrusive research methods. And this is collecting data when people don't know that the data is being collected. This can be done, looking at the nature of the cities through different documents, who's watching television, stuff, records the people of events, and I'll talk about privacy concerns. The book has some pretty good examples of the types of unobtrusive research methods. On page 297, the researchers have assessed the degree of fear caused by telling ghost stories to children by observing the shrinking diameter of the circle of seated children. Thought that was kind of interesting. Researchers have measured boredom by the amount of fidgeting movements in audience. The rate of library withdrawals of fiction and nonfiction books has been studied to determine the impact of television in communities. This one's kind of interesting. Researchers have noticed that children demonstrate their interest in Christmas by the size of their drawings of Santa Claus and the amount of distortion in the figures. So again, this method is where the people don't know that they're being researched. They take information from reports from the city and those type of things. I thought another interesting study was using city records was analyzed of city water pressure as an index of television viewing interest. Immediately after a television show, the water pressure dropped as drinks were obtained and toilets flushed. I thought that was kind of interesting. Mabley in 1963 presented data on Chicago's water pressure on the day of an exciting Rose Bowl game that showed a drastic drop in pressure at the time of the game's end as everybody's going to the bathroom and flushing the toilet. And so I thought it was kind of interesting. Again, the whole point of this is that people don't know that they're being observed. There was an old, I can't remember the name of the television show where people were being recorded on TV, and people are acting strange, and they were recording how people would act, people acting in a strange method, and then they would show, and at the end of the episode, they would tell them, hey, you're on TV or whatever like that. You know, this is strange stuff, and maybe some of you seen that TV show. The biggest concern with unobtrusive research is privacy concerns. You can violate people's privacy. So I don't really expect anybody in this graduate program to actually do unobtrusive research, but I thought you should know about unobtrusive research. And maybe you'll be on TV one of these days. The last method we're going to talk about is correlational research. We have talked about correlational research, the statistical methods, when we talked about correlational statistics. Again, what we're talking about is exploring relationships between variables. Does variable X have a relationship to Y? Does smoking have a relationship to cancer? Yes. There's not a cause and effect there, but there is a relationship between them. And then when we're talking about strictly descriptive research, we're trying to determine if the variables are related to each other, or can we make a prediction based on the event or the outcome of the variables. We're just describing that relationship. We're not trying to set up a experimental design with this one. Okay, all we're trying to do is describe the relationship between variable X and variable Y, or the prediction. Like percent body fat is a prediction variable. It's based on a mathematical equation that we can make a prediction on somebody's percent body fat based on skinfold caliper measurements. And descriptive research, or correlational research is based on the characteristics of the nature of the participants, the spread of scores, and the shrinkage and prediction. Now, the nature of the participants, what we're talking about there is some of the participants just might be more like one another because who they are. Some kids are more like one another, and other kids are like kids, but they're not like adults. If we did the exact same test with adults versus kids, there probably wouldn't be a relationship there. And a good example of this is back in when we were going over correlational research, I gave you a research study about juggling, a transfer of motor learning. One of the parts of the results is the non-dominant group had a very high relationship. They had a pretty high correlational Pearson's R score. Well, if you look at the numbers were close because they didn't change at all because they never learned anything. There wasn't really a relationship between them. They just didn't learn. The numbers made it look like they were close. That's the spread of scores. That's what I'm talking about here. Is just the scores can really lie. You have to really do some interpretation. Is there really a relationship going on there? Did really anything happen? In that particular study, if you go back and look at it, the mean values never really changed that much with the control group, and that's what you expect. You expect a control group not to have any change, but the experimental group had some kind of change. So if we describe that, we would describe that the experimental group showed a change in behavior over time. In the shrinkage in prediction, typically prediction equations are only reliable for subjects used in a study and not for the whole population. It could be, we just have to think about how many subjects a particular study had. If we had low numbers of subjects, probably not going to be a very good study there. The whole point of correlational research in this setting is to describe the relationship between variables and help us to make prediction. Again, correlational research does not establish a cause and effect. Smoking does not cause cancer. There is a relationship between smoking and cancer. If you smoke, you have a higher likelihood that you get cancer, but it's not a direct cause. It's not a cause of cancer. There's other variables that come into play with that. So in a summary, descriptive research means describing the subjects, not determining cause and effect. All we're doing is using descriptive statistics in our design and our words to describe what's going on with those particular subjects and try to make some understanding of what's going on with that particular group of subjects at that time. There are several different methods that we use in descriptive research. Developmental, we're trying to see how people develop over time. We have case studies. We can look at a small group, 1 or 2 people, or an organization, which would be a job analysis, to understand how that case, what it looks like, and then try to help others understand how to use that case in their organization or with other situations. There's observational research, where the researcher or researchers go and observe the subjects, look for particular behaviors over time to see how they're displayed. There's unobtrusive descriptive research, where the subjects don't realize that they are being researched, and we make some decisions or conclusions based on other things other than just behaviors of the subjects, hence the toilet flushing after games. We can know that water pressure goes down because a lot of people are going to the bathroom at the end of a TV show. Then correlational research designs. These designs are to help us understand the relationship between variables, to describe what that relationship is like, and to help us make predictions in the future. So again, descriptive research used to describe what's going on.